Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Marielle Marcano Olivier, and today we are going to be discussing Psychopathology 1, Paradigms and Contemporary Discussions. We're going to be doing this over two separate lectures this week, so we'll be doing two paradigms and one discussion today on Monday, and we'll be doing two paradigms and two discussions on Wednesday. So, today we're going to be discussing what is psychopathology and how do we define it. We are then going to be looking at the paradigms of psychodynamic psychology and biological psychology, and then we are going to be watching a short TED Talk and having a class discussion about what we see in that TED Talk. And then on Wednesday we'll be covering the other two paradigms of modern psychology, behavioural and cognitive psychology. And then we'll be having a discussion about whether or not an addict can be blamed for their behaviour, considering the paradigms that we've learnt about. And then discussion 2 will be about gendered depression. Why is there a higher prevalence of depression seen in females as opposed to males? So, what is psychopathology? Psychopathology is defined as the study of psychiatric disorders, such as generalized anxiety disorder and major depressive disorder. This is the part of the lecture where I would ask you as a class to discuss in your groups how you would define abnormal behaviour, and at what point does it become pathological. This mini group discussion would take around 3 minutes. Instead, what I'm going to ask you to do is pause this lecture and just have a think to yourself about what you think defines abnormal behaviour and at what point it becomes pathological. So at what point does it become a mental health condition? It can be very difficult to identify what is pathological behaviour from what behaviour is just different from what we know in our daily lives. So we're going to discuss 4 definitions of abnormality. The first is statistical infrequency. Under this definition of abnormality, we assume that a behaviour is abnormal if it occurs infrequently in the population. So let's use schizophrenia as an example. Now, schizophrenic disorders occur infrequently in the population. That is, that whilst it is a well-known psychiatric disorder, the amount of people in the population with that disorder is very small compared to the amount of people in the population that do not have that disorder. However, the definition of abnormality of statistical infrequency is not completely infallible. For example, here we can see the bell curve of IQ based on IQ testing. Now, the average IQ is an IQ of around 100, so between 95 and 105. We expect the majority of people to fall within that range. That means it is statistically infrequent for someone to have an IQ that is actually 140. This would occur infrequently in the population. However, whilst it is technically abnormal, it isn't pathological. So this definition of abnormality actually also includes people that are not pathological, and therefore this definition of abnormality does not fully cover pathological behaviours. The next definition of abnormality is deviation from social norms. So this is when behaviour is considered abnormal if it violates the unwritten rules that we abide by in society. For example, if we take the example of schizophrenia again, people with schizophrenia might talk to themselves in public because they are having auditory hallucinations. Now, this would be a deviation from social norm, that you are not talking to yourself in public, and therefore that would be considered abnormal. However, social norms are highly culture bound, and so what we consider to be abnormal might not be the same as what someone from another culture might consider to be abnormal. For example, in the UK, if you were to take a 3-hour break in the middle of the working day between 2 and 5 and insist on doing that, then that would probably have quite a negative impact on your working day, on your job and your relationships with your boss and with your colleagues. However, in Spain and in other Mediterranean countries, this is actually considered to be very normal. In fact, it's recommended. Now, this is called a siesta. People take a siesta, so a long break during the day between 2 and 5 p.m. Now, this is to avoid the midday heat, to enjoy a long and healthy lunch, to limit working hours during that midday heat, to have the potential to have a rest in the afternoon, and also so that they might be more energetic and awake to enjoy a late night lifestyle. Now, this in Spain and in other Mediterranean countries, as I said, is considered to be recommended and healthy. However, if you were to do this in the UK, you would be violating the social norm of working during the 9 to 5 working day, as is quite typical. Of course, if you work in other shift times, then it's not quite relevant. But if you were working the typical 9 to 5 routes and you were taking 3-hour breaks in the middle of the day to have a big lunch and a nap, then this might be considered to be very abnormal. So, again, this definition of abnormality doesn't quite cover or it includes behaviours that, whilst they might be abnormal to us, are not pathological. And so again, this definition is not completely infallible. The third definition of abnormality that we're going to cover is failure to function adequately. Now, this is an assessment of whether or not the individual is able to engage with the aspects of life that ensure well-being. Now, if we consider schizophrenia again, one of the symptoms of schizophrenia is to neglect oneself, so neglect one's own personal hygiene, and to withdraw socially. Now, in this way, they are not functioning adequately. However, one way to function adequately might be to be able to get out of bed and go and maintain a normal work-life balance. However, some people with physical disabilities might be bedbound or might not be able to totally look after themselves. And so they're not going to be able to engage with these aspects of life very easily, or some people might not be able to engage with these aspects of life easily. However, this does not mean that they have a psychopathology. So this definition of abnormality does not consider those differences. The final definition of abnormality is deviation from ideal mental health. Now, as with physical health, abnormality is defined by what is considered to deviate from what is healthy. This theory was created by Jehoda in 1958, and he suggested 6 criteria necessary for ideal mental health. An absence of these would indicate that the individual is behaving abnormally. In other words, they are deviating from ideal mental health. Now, these criteria include having a positive view of the self, capability for growth and development, autonomy and independence, having an accurate perception of reality, having positive friendships and relationships, and having environmental mastery, so being able to meet the varying demands of day-to-day situations. This last one is very similar to our previous definition of abnormality, failure to function adequately. According to this approach, the more of these criteria that are satisfied, the healthier the individual is. However, a lack or failure of these characteristics and abilities implies that the individual is abnormal or has some kind of psychiatric disorder. At this point in the lecture, I would have asked you to discuss and identify the strengths and weaknesses of each definition of abnormality. However, because we're now working from home, instead, I'm going to ask you to post your ideas on the discussion forum. So please take 10 minutes to consider each definition of abnormality and consider the strengths and weaknesses, and post your ideas onto the forum. To remind you, these definitions include statistical infrequency, deviation from social norms, failure to function adequately, and deviation from ideal mental health. It's now time to take a 10-minute break. After the break, we will move on to discussing two of the paradigms in psychopathology, the first being psychodynamic and the second being biological. The psychodynamic approach began with Freud's writings between the 1890s and the 1930s, and these make up the assumptions of the psychodynamic approach. The first assumption is that our behaviour and internal experiences are influenced by our unconscious. The second is that the personality is made of three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. And the third is that behaviour and internal experiences are rooted in our childhood experiences. So, let's discuss the first assumption. Our behaviour and internal experiences are influenced by our unconscious. According to Freud in 1915, the unconscious mind is at the core of our thoughts, feelings, and behaviour. He considered this to be like an iceberg. So with an iceberg, as you can see, there is a little of the iceberg poking above the water. This is what we can see when we are above the water. However, the vast majority of the iceberg actually sits below the water. Now, Freud believed this to be similar to our motivations. We are somewhat aware of our motivations towards our thoughts, feelings, and behaviour. However, much of the motivation, much of the reasons for our behaviour actually lies below our consciousness, in our unconscious. Our feelings, motives, and decisions are actually powerfully influenced by our past experiences, and these experiences are stored in our unconscious, guiding our behaviour, but not actively accessible to our conscious mind. The second assumption of the psychodynamic approach is that of the tripartite model of personality. Now, this means that the personality is made up of three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is our part of personality that is present from birth. It is our pleasure principle. Our id requires immediate gratification and will be very upset and angry if we don't get exactly what we want exactly when we want it. We are born with this part of our personality, and only having this part of our personality explains why babies don't have the ability to wait to be fed, to not cry if they're uncomfortable, that their immediate response is to scream and be upset and whine if they don't get what they want. They don't understand the concepts of delayed gratification, and everything that they're feeling at that time is the most important thing in the world to them. That is until they develop their ego. Your ego is your reality principle, and this develops around the age of 1 to 2 years old. Now, the ego balances the demands of the id. It is more aware of the conscious, of the demands of the real world, and is aware of how other people feel. The ego makes decisions about behaviour, and so the ego considers the demands of the id, but doesn't necessarily immediately gratify these demands. This is why around the age of 1 and 2, between 1 to 2, we can see children are somewhat able to wait to be fed, to wait for something they want. Of course, this doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to wait hours before they start screaming and crying, but they can understand somewhat that the world doesn't necessarily revolve around them, and that sometimes other things have to be considered. Finally, we have the superego. Now, this is the morality principle, and this develops when the child progresses through the phallic stage of psychosexual development. More on that later. Now, the phallic stage of psychosexual development occurs around the age of 6, and so the superego will develop around that time as well. The superego is hyper-conscious about the needs of others and incorporates morals into behaviour. So if you think of it this way, you have a little devil on your shoulder demanding things all the time, and that is your id. You have a little angel on your shoulder telling you to never do anything to gratify yourself because the needs of others are always more important. And then in the middle, balancing them, you have your ego, considering the demands of the id and also considering the needs of others in the superego. The ego then makes the decision about how to behave in order to somewhat gratify the id while still satisfying the superego. Sometimes the ego gets stressed, as I imagine that you guys will have experienced before. If two of your friends are fighting and you're stuck in the middle and you want to satisfy them both but you can't, then it does get quite stressful. If the ego becomes stressed, it engages in something called ego defense mechanisms. Now, we're not going to cover those today, but one example of an ego defense mechanism is regression. Now, this means that you regress to a childlike state when you become anxious, upset, angry, or stressed. So, if someone says that you're behaving in a childish way when you're stressed or upset, this might be because your ego has got overstressed, because it wants to balance the demands of your id, but it also wants to satisfy your superego. And so rather than responding in an emotionally healthy way, your ego engages in defense mechanisms to protect itself, and that is why you might act in a childish way when you're stressed. The id, the ego, and the superego can also be conceptualized in the iceberg analogy. The ego sits somewhat on top of the water. You're somewhat aware of the realities that guide your behavior. The ego also sort of sits a little on top of the water because you're aware of your motivations to make sure that other people are okay. But largely, your superego sits in the unconscious. Your ego mainly sits in the preconscious and unconscious. And your id sits directly in your unconscious. You do not have conscious access to the demands of your id. The third assumption of the psychodynamic approach is that adult behavior and internal experiences are rooted in childhood experiences. Now, this is covered in his theory of psychosexual stages of development. Freud believed that events in our childhood influence our adult lives and shape our adult personalities. Events in childhood remain in the unconscious, so they're not actively accessible with our consciousness, but these experiences still guide our behavior and influence our adult feelings and behavior. Personality is shaped during this psychosexual stages in development. These are the psychosexual stages of development. There are 5 stages, and they are the oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic stage, the latency stage, and the genital stage. Now, these develop one after the other throughout your childhood, and at each point, the focus of gaining pleasure is at a different part of your body. This is called your libido focus. If you manage to progress through each stage without some kind of disruption or upheaval, then Freud believes that you become a mentally healthy adult. However, if there is some kind of disruption at any of the stages, you might become fixated at that stage of development. These fixations have different impacts on your adult behavior depending on at which stage you become fixated. The oral stage occurs from birth up until about the age of 1. At this point, the child is exploring everything with their mouth, and they're also being breastfed. So most of their pleasure, most of their enjoyment is through their mouth. This is why it is the oral stage. If a child is overindulged at this stage or neglected at this stage, then they might develop an oral fixation. An oral fixation in adult personality might manifest itself as an eating disorder or being addicted to smoking. The next stage is the anal stage. Now, this develops between about the age of 1 and 2. This is when we expect that children would be potty training. And during potty training, children learn that they have more control over their bodies than they have before. they're able to control when they defecate, and for this reason, their focus of pleasure is on their anus. If they become fixated during this stage, they can develop adult traits such as obsessive-compulsive disorder, or, on the other hand, they could be incredibly messy and disorganized. They could be very controlling or very lackadaisical. It depends on what type of fixation they have. If they have an anally retentive fixation, then they might develop OCD. If they have an anally expulsive fixation, then they might become messy and disorganized. It is at this stage that the ego develops, when the child is able to understand that sometimes they have to delay gratification because they have to consider the reality. The next stage of development is the phallic stage. Now this occurs between the ages of 3 and 6. And at this stage, children are just discovering their bodies and realise that their genitals look different to other people's genitals, to the other gender's genitals. If the child becomes fixated at this stage, Freud believed they would experience sexual or moral dysfunction in adulthood. He also believed that fixation at this stage might result in homosexuality and immorality, and it is at this point that the superego develops. So as we can see, the ego develops during the anal stage, and the superego develops during the phallic stage. But the development of the superego is not as simple as simply going through the phallic stage. Instead, during the phallic stage, children also experience either the Oedipus complex if they are a boy, or the Electra complex if they are a girl. This is where the child falls in love with their opposite sex parent. So, a little boy would fall in love with his mother, and a little girl would fall in love with her father. However, the child sees that their same-sex parent is in the way, that they are in a relationship with their opposite-sex parent, and therefore the child wants to kill them. It is at this point where male children would experience something called castration anxiety. Now, they want to kill their father because they are in love with their mother, but they can't kill their father because they are scared that their father will win this fight, or that they will find out that they want to kill their father, and in a fit of rage might cut off their penis. So they experience castration anxiety. At this stage, little girls would be feeling penis envy. This is where they see that their father has a penis and they want to have a penis as well. However, they can't have a penis because they are a girl, and so they are jealous of their mother because she has access to her father's penis, and so they feel penis envy. However, the child realises it's unrealistic to kill their same-sex parent. Their same-sex parent has an advantage, and so they probably won't win. The child instead identifies with their same-sex parent and takes on their moral compass, and this is the superego, when the child identifies with their same-sex parent and takes on their morals, so their superego. So instead, they will be able to grow up and find a partner of their own. Men, or little boys, want to grow up and find a partner like their mother so that they can complete their Electra complex, their Oedipus complex, whereas little girls want to grow up and be like their mother so that they can be in a relationship with a man and therefore have access to his penis, or so that they might have a son and therefore have access to his penis. Freud was very strange, and this is a very interesting take on how you develop morals. So you go through the anal stage and the phallic stage, and after you have successfully completed the phallic stage, at this point you will have your id, your ego, and your superego. During the latency stage, between the ages of 6 and puberty, there is no libido focus. Instead, children are becoming excited about playing and making friends with same-sex children. At the genital stage, beyond puberty, the libido focus goes back to genitals, and at this point, adolescents become, develop feelings for opposite sex partners, and because the libido focus is back on the genitals, these people want to then have a sexual relationship with someone of the opposite sex. Freud considered that if you go through all the stages of development and get to the genital stage, that you will therefore be a mentally healthy person. However, disruption could mean issues in adult personality. These include disordered eating, OCD, and sexual immorality, for example, homosexuality. And so, of course, this approach is actually very homophobic and that does need to be addressed. The last paradigm we're going to talk about today is the biological approach. Now, the broad assumption of the biological approach is that psychopathology is the result of physiological abnormalities. Now, these fall into three categories. The first is biochemical imbalances. The second is physical brain abnormalities. And the third is a genetic, so a hereditary predisposition. So let's first discuss biochemical imbalances. Now, the assumption of this is that abnormality is the result of chemical imbalance. These chemicals are neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are electrochemical messengers that transmit electrical impulses, so messages, around the brain via neurons, so pathways. The image on the screen now is a neuron. If you can see, there's a label that says dendrites. Now, these are parts of a neuron that look like tree branches. Neurotransmitters collect at the end of the dendrite, and depending on what information those neurotransmitters carry, they either make the neuron more or less likely to fire an electrical impulse through the axon and down to the axon terminal. These axon terminals then send information onto the next neuron's dendrites, and so on and so forth. Now, what makes a neuron more or less likely to fire the information that neurotransmitters give them is whether they are excitatory or inhibitory. Some neurotransmitters can be excitatory, and this means they are more likely to send an electrical impulse down the neuron. Or they can be inhibitory. Now, this means that they are less likely to send an electrical impulse down the neuron. The neurotransmitter connects here. If you remember, on the previous image, we can see the axon terminals connect to or send messages to the next neuron, and the next neuron picks up these messages on their dendrites. Here, we can see an axon terminal here, and the end of a dendrite here. The neurotransmitter collects here and sends messages from one neuron to the other. Whether they are excitatory or inhibitory depends on whether or not the next neuron will fire the message down that neuron. According to the biological approach, imbalances of mood-stabilizing neurotransmitters, such as serotonin or dopamine, can cause depression. The second assumption of the biological approach is that abnormality is caused by brain injury or a brain growth issue. Different parts of the brain are associated with different functions. For example, the occipital lobe is associated with our ability to see, and our parietal lobe is associated with our motor movements. Damage to the brain can create abnormality, because if an individual is damaged in an area, then they are not fully able to function in the area of behaviour that part of their brain was associated with. We can see this phenomena in Phineas Gage. Now, Phineas Gage worked on a train line in the 1800s. When he was working on this train line, he experienced a terrible accident at work, and a large steel pole shot through his skull. Now, miraculously, he survived. However, he ended up expressing opinions that he hadn't expressed before, behaving more violently and more sexually aggressively, and in general just behaving very different to how he used to. Now, this poll went straight through Phineas Gage's prefrontal cortex. This is the cortex that we associate with impulsive behaviour, and therefore, if that area is damaged, the individual might become more impulsive and less aware of socially acceptable behaviour, and this is what we saw in Phineas Gage. Therefore, we can assume from this case study, along with many other case studies, that brain damage can actually cause behavioural abnormality. The final assumption of the biological approach is that abnormality can be caused by genetic predisposition. That is, that behavioural abnormality is the result of genetic abnormality. Charles Darwin wrote in his publication on the origin of species about a process that he called natural selection. He stated that genes are genetic information carried by DNA in chromosomes and found within a cell's nucleus, and that variations in our physical selves are the results of inheriting these genes from our parents. In line with Darwin's theory of evolution, it might also follow that genes form a basis of our behaviour, as both behaviour and genes appear to be heritable. There is some support, a lot of support for this theory in research. An example of this is rates of depression. So, this is a study discussing rates of depression in monozygotic twins, and that is identical twins, or dizygotic twins, so non-identical twins. The concordance rate is the percentage of time that both twins have depression. Now, as you can see, the concordance rate for male monozygotic twins is 45.8%. For women, it's 45.5%. Now, if we look at the dizygotic twins, we can see that the concordance rate is 14.8% for men and 22% for women. Now, if you consider that monozygotic twins have or share 100% of their DNA, and dizygotic twins only share 50% of their DNA, if this behaviour was inherited, then we would expect the dizygotic twins to have approximately half the concordance rate of the monozygotic twins. And as we can see here, if you look at the combined concordance rate for monozygotic twins, it's 45.6%. For dizygotic twins, it's 20.2%. So that is approximately half the concordance rate of monozygotic twins for dizygotic twins. This supports the theory that depression can be inherited. Now we have finished the taught content of our class for today. What I'd like you to do now is watch the TED Talk on this slide. In this TED Talk, comedian Ruby Wax discusses mental illness. Since her career in comedy, she has become a clinical psychologist, and she's researched in mental health. She shares her opinions on mental health and stigma in this TED Talk. I'd like you to watch this TED Talk and consider the questions at the side of the screen. What is your response to this talk? Do you agree or disagree with the statements that Ruby Wax makes? Do you believe that modern life contributes to mental illness? Do you believe that stigma is a societal issue? I'd like you to post your response in the associated forum. Feedback will be given via a vlog on Thursday afternoon. Thank you very much for coming to my lecture today, and I can't wait to see you on Wednesday.